Okay, let's get started. Chapter 4, Estates and Interests in Real Property. And when we talk about real estate, we're really talking about estates and or interests in real property. And we're talking about the completeness of the holding of the bundle of rights, as well as the duration. And what we're going to find out that the real property, estates and interest in real property, are for an indefinite period of time, and that's what makes them real property. A lease, by the way, is personal property, and a lease is for a definite period of time, and you're only getting the right of possession. So again, estates and interest in real property. So real estate is defined as the land, the earth's surface, to the center of the earth below, to the heavens above, and all things attached by man or nature. So a house is attached by man, it becomes part of the real property. A fence is attached by man, it becomes part of the real property. Trees are attached by nature or potentially by man, they become part of the real property. Any minerals that you might have underneath your property are part of the real property. Any oil that's beneath your property is part of the real property. To the center of the earth below and to the heavens above, the airspace above your property is your real property. By the way, the reason airplanes can fly over your house is because of an act of Congress that said you can't regulate air traffic over your house. One of the strange things, it's also the reason why drones can fly over your house without your permission. So I see somebody raise their hand, and let's see if I can unmute you, or unmute yourself. And
can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so since minerals and everything is a real property, what about when you buy land, only land? Now, is there another right you have to buy for the minerals?
Nope. So as long as the previous owner has not given those rights away, then they belong to you. As long as the previous owner has not given those rights away, they belong to you. Same thing with the oil beneath your property. Same thing with the water beneath your property. Those rights belong to you, unless they've been given away previously. And how would you find out if they were given away previously? When you did a title search, the title search would then look for a deed where a previous owner had granted the mineral rights to someone else. If you watch those shows on TV where the guys are searching for gold all the time, I don't know if you pay much attention to them, but they're only able to mine for gold on people's property for a short period of time. And the reason it's only a short period of time is they are leasing the rights to mine the gold for that period of time. And then any gold they take out, they get to keep. But underneath your property, it is your own property, the minerals or the water. Now, here's a really strange circumstance. And again, I want to say that the oil beneath your property is your own, the oil beneath your property. If it hasn't been given away, if somebody previously did not use a deed to transfer the oil rights to somebody else, it's your own property. Well, years ago, part of the reason that Iraq invaded Kuwait, if you remember, that was one of the reasons for the first Gulf War, was that Iraq had invaded Kuwait. Part of the reason that Iraq invaded Kuwait was that we had sold to Kuwait a technology for drilling oil that allowed the oil drill bit to go straight down and then to make a right angle turn. And so what Kuwait had been doing was, if we assumed that this was the boundary line between Iraq and Kuwait, sort of underground, Kuwait had been going down and then making a right angle turn and then sucking the oil from underneath Iraq. That's one of the reasons Iraq was aggravated and invaded Kuwait. It's not what was shown in our media around here. I guess they were trying to achieve some other ends, but that's one of the reasons. And that's something that quite often happens. As an example, we have the rights in real property to the water that's underneath our property. But we can't take so much water out from underneath our property that we deprive other people of the rights to the water. And an interesting case of that is in California. There's a giant aquifer that's in the San Joaquin Valley, where there's a lot of farming going on. So here's the land, and an aquifer is a gigantic lake under the ground. And there's some crops in Florida that take a lot of water. One of the crops is almonds. Almonds take an incredible amount of water to grow. And so what had happened was the almond farmers were tapping into this aquifer, and as they sucked it out, they reduced the level of the aquifer to 40% of its entire level. And what happened, it was depriving people downstream or further away from the ability to get to the aquifer. And again, that was a big deal, and it was a court case. The thing that ended that court case, ended the urgency of the court case, is they got a lot of rain in California over the last 5 or 6 years. So that aquifer filled back up again. So again, these kind of rights are very unique to real estate, and these kind of rights often cause a dispute. One more interesting anecdote, and that's that in the Hatfield and McCoy miniseries that was on TV last year, the Hatfields and the McCoys had a gigantic feud that's like part of American history from these hillbillies in the mountains. And part of the reason they had a feud is one of the Hatfields bought a mountain, real estate, from one of the McCoys. And when he went to take ownership of that mountain, because he had bought it, he found out that the grantor had given the timber rights to someone else. He had given the rights to harvest all the trees to someone else. So the mountain was basically worthless. So that was one of the things that caused the feud. And remember, trees are attached by nature, so therefore they become part of the real property. So the fact that he had given the timber rights away, again, was one of the things that spurred the Hatfield and McCoy's feud. It's kind of American folklore. Okay.
Hey, Bruce.
So,
Hey, Bruce.
Yes.
I have 2 questions for that. What about if you purchase a house and you find out that the owner sold the right to somebody else? Did that decrease the value of the house? Or?
Yes, sure. In Los Angeles, if you drive around Los Angeles, just in regular residential neighborhoods, you're going to see a lot of properties in Los Angeles that actually have oil wells on. Let's see, I need to get back to a right slide. You'll see a lot of residential properties that have an oil well on it. And that's because an owner at some point may have sold the oil rights to a third party. And so now if you buy the house, you might have that oil well still pumping oil out, and it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to a third party. So again, how would you find out whether your rights to that's something that's considered real property, like the oil or like the water beneath your property, has been given away? You'd find it in the title search, because the manner in which somebody would give away the rights to the oil below their property, would they do it? They would do it with a deed, and that deed would be recorded. Okay.
So Bruce, is the seller responsible of informing the buyer of these rights that are? Is it his responsibility to disclose that information? Because that would void a contract.
So good question. On the listing agreement, when you sign a listing agreement, and sometimes in the attorney review correspondence, it asks if the seller has granted any easements or any other rights to the property that the buyer is not aware of. But remember from last night, we are a caveat emptor state. It's up to the buyer to find out if those rights have gone away or not gone away. Now, down in this bottom corner here is a famous court case. This is the Fountainbleu Hotel in Miami Beach. And the Fountainbleu Hotel was on the beach in Miami Beach, but it wasn't right on the beach. And so another hotel complex bought the land right in front of the Fountainbleu Hotel, and they built a larger hotel that kind of shadowed it so that the sun couldn't get through and shine on the Fountainbleu. And what happened was the Fountainbleu Hotel said, well, maybe the ability to let sunlight through is part of our real rights, our real property rights. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that shadowing does not come with real property rights. So the Fountainbleu lost that case, and the other hotel was able to build right in front of it, which shadowed it from being able to get sunlight in the afternoon sun. Now, another interesting thing is there is a lot in New York City of people buying air rights. So I'm going to use the Fountainbleu Hotel as an example again, but that's not what happened with the Fountainbleu Hotel. But say you had a hotel that was this high, and Donald Trump is famous for this, you might have air rights. You might have air rights on that hotel, and I'm so sorry. I'm clicking that off before I get the annotate part in there. You might have air rights above that hotel that allow you to build an additional 5 stories up on top. And Donald Trump goes to people who have air rights and he buys their air rights, and so that he's able to then build on top of their buildings, and that'll be his building. And if you've ever driven over the George Washington Bridge and got on the major Deegan Expressway going to Yankee Stadium, there's actually right above the highway, there's a whole section of apartments right above the highway. So the highway goes right underneath these apartments, and that's because somebody sold the air rights above the highway to this developer to build apartments up there. So this is all stuff that we all have to be concerned with when we buy real estate. And how do we find out whether we need to, if we have those rights or not, is we do a title search, because we would transfer those rights, whether they're the air rights, whether they're the rights to harvest the timber, whether they're the rights to take the oil out from underneath, or whether they're the rights to go in and mine underneath. Those rights are all transferred by deed. So if you wanted to know if somebody had the rights to go under your property and take all the coal out, you would go and look at the county clerk's office and see if there was a deed recorded giving somebody that authority. Okay? So good questions. It shows the stuff that's sinking into your heads. All right, we also have a lot of rights that are associated with water. And for some reason, these are always on the test. Riparian rights are the rights that are associated with flowing water. So if you look at the picture below, you see ripples on this stream. And remember, riparian rights are flowing water. Riparian rights have to do with streams and rivers that are flowing, that have ripples on the stream. We also have littoral rights. Littoral rights and littoral land are the rights to where you have bodies of water that are affected by the tides, by tidal currents, bigger bodies of water, and the rights to them are littoral rights. So think of litter on the beach. Think of litter on the beach, and then we remember littoral rights are the rights alongside the ocean that give you the rights to where the high tide comes up to, or the rights to moor your boat off of that piece of land. So rights associated with larger bodies of water are called littoral rights. There's another type of water in New Jersey and in the United States. It's called the Navigable Waterway. In the Constitution, navigable waterways are defined, and the Army Corps of Engineers maintains an inventory of navigable waterways. They have a certain degree of depth and a certain degree of width, and was a sailing ship able to navigate on those particular waterways. And if it's a navigable waterway, then the land is underneath the waterway is owned by the federal government. And again, another weird anecdote, if you watch the Netflix special Ozarks, the reason the guys in Ozarks were able to open a casino is because they opened it on a navigable waterway that was in Missouri, and that navigable waterway is federal property. And so Missouri couldn't stop them from opening the casino on the navigable waterway once they got a casino permit. So that's part of the subplot of the series Ozarks. So again, navigable waterways are owned by the federal government. Now, why? Why is that such a big deal? It's a big deal because back in 1776, the main way that you moved heavy material or heavy goods or heavy food or farm products was by water. As a matter of fact, the first interstate transportation system was the Delaware-Raritan Canal that allowed you to move a lot of heavy product alongside the Raritan River via a barge being towed by mules. And then the Erie Canal opened up to the Great Lakes, which allowed people from New York to then reach the Great Lakes, to then reach the Mississippi River. So navigable waterways were extremely important in the days before we had other modes of transportation, and those rights still exist today. The next thing is we talk about the fact that water can add or remove land. So water can remove land by erosion. It washes it away. During Hurricane Sandy, some of the barrier islands in New Jersey were breached. The water overcame the barrier islands and the land was washed away, and that removes real property. We can also add land by the activity of water. And we add land through the process called accretion. And accretion has two forms, alluvion or reliction. And if you add land through alluvion or reliction, creating accretion, you gain title through accession. Now, that's really tough to memorize. So you gain title through accession. Accretion is the process by which you gain land through either alluvion or reliction. Alluvion is the slow, imperceptible deposit of soil from water that makes land. And a great example is the Mississippi River. The nickname of the Mississippi River is Big Muddy, M-U-D-D-Y, because it carries a lot of mud in it. And as the Mississippi River flows southward, it's going to hit the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans. And the New Orleans Delta is actually formed over 1,000 years by the activity of the soil precipitating and making land. And that's because as the water from the Mississippi hits the Gulf of Mexico, the amount of energy in the water that's able to support those particles changes, and the particles, kind of go to the bottom and create land. That's alluvion. And again, picture on the bottom right-hand corner shows how alluvion works and land being created by a little bit at a time. The water gets shallower and shallower and shallower until you start to create land. The other method is reliction. Reliction is when you pump out water and what's left below is land. So Holland is a good example of reliction, the Netherlands, because much of Holland is 2 feet below sea level. So what they did was they put up dikes, a type of dam, and they pumped out the seawater, and what's left is land. So they created land through reliction. By the way, when Holland was first invaded by the Germans in World War II, the first thing they did was they opened all the dikes and let all the land get flooded again. So again, you could create land through alluvion or through reliction, and you gain title to it through accession. Now there's another concept, and the concept is called avulsion. Many times we define the boundaries of real property, like the boundary between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, by water, by the Delaware River, right? That defines the boundary between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And if the Delaware River were to flood, and all of a sudden the flow moved by a couple of miles because of the storm or the flood or an earthquake, as soon as the river went back to its original property lines, the property boundaries would not change. In other words, just because there's a flood and the property boundary is defined as the high tide mark of the river, and on the flood, the high tide mark changes by 5 miles, it doesn't mean the property boundaries change. When the flow goes back to its original boundaries, then the property lines are restored. And that's called avulsion. Okay? So for some reason, these are always on the test. For some reason, these are always on the test. And I apologize to the people that I left waiting for a few minutes to get, I apologize to the people I left waiting for a few minutes to get admitted. Sometimes I don't see it. All right, so we can remove land through erosion. We can add it through the process of accretion. 2 methods are alluvion and reliction. If we do add that land, how do we gain title? And that's through accession. I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures in Hawaii when the volcano is active and it's spewing all this molten magma down to the ocean, and it drops in and all the steam rises and it looks real impressive. Well, it's actually creating new land. As that activity happens, we're actually creating new land. And again, we would gain title to that new land. We would gain title to that new land by the process of accession. Another thing unique to New Jersey is there was a time when all New Jersey beaches were privately owned. When I grew up, when I was 10 years old, you couldn't go on most of the beaches on the Jersey Shore. They were privately owned. And they had a court case, Bayhead versus Matthews, in the 1980s, where the courts decided that the beaches were part of public property. So everybody's allowed to go on the beach. So for instance, you can go to Belmore now, and you're going to have to buy a beach tag to go on the beach because there's lifeguards there, but they have to let everybody on the beach. If you go on the off season, you don't have to buy a beach tag, but everybody has to be allowed to go on the beach. Big court case now going on in California about this. Who owns the beaches in California? And there's many very wealthy property owners that own oceanfront properties in California. And the court case is working its way through California, where they're going to try to make all those beaches public again. So again, this is a big deal. And right now in New Jersey, because of Bayhead versus Matthews, we all have the rights to go on any beach. We might have to pay because there's lifeguards, but we have the rights to go on the beach.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes.
Going back with Hawaii, I was reading something about Hawaii. They're talking about you can own a house in Hawaii, but you don't own the land. Is that the purpose?
So that has nothing to do with the fact that they're creating new land, but there's some places in Hawaii where they don't sell you the land. They give you a long-term lease for the land. So you have a lease for the land, and you're building your own property on the land. Now I don't know exactly what properties have that as part of their ownership in Hawaii, but I can tell you in China, that is absolutely always the case. In China, you do not, when you buy real property in China, you do not own the land. You get a 50-year lease or a 99-year lease, and even if you're building a giant hotel, you don't own the land. You get a 50-year lease or a 99-year lease, or whatever you work out with the government. So it makes the ownership of real property in China, makes it a little risky, because what if the government decides they don't want you to own anything anymore? That's a consideration. In Hawaii, I don't have an answer to why they do land leases, but usually we see that in commercial applications. All right, the next thing is our definition of real property as opposed to personal property. Remember, it's more important to own real property. That's why it's harder to take it away. That's why it takes a long time to foreclose. Personal property is less important, and that's why you can miss a payment on your car, and they can just take it from you in the middle of the night. On your house, you miss payments, they have to get in front of a judge, and it takes 4 years to foreclose. On your car, which is personal property, they can take your car after one missed payment. I'll give you another really weird anecdote. In Virginia, just before the Civil War, Virginia was a slave state, and they were very concerned that they were going to emancipate all the slaves. So one of the techniques that Virginia did to postpone emancipation was to declare all slaves real property. They wrote a law that said all slaves are real property, which means they were permanently attached to the earth. It didn't work, and the courts overturned it. But the state of Virginia, that was an attempt to stop the northern states from saying no more slavery in their state. So again, this thing between real property and personal property is very important. Don't forget, in England, only people in England who were in the royal family could own real property. So in the United States, it was considered like a luxury that just a common man could own real property. So real property is is attached to the earth. And real property can change from real to personal. So we look at these trees. These trees are real property. They're permanently attached to the earth. But we come in and we chop them down. When we chop the trees down, now they're personal property. And the activity of chopping those trees down is called severance. S-E-V-E-R-A-N-C-E, severance. Like you sever your veins or you get severed from your company. It means you get cut off. So if we unattach them, they become real, they go from real property to personal property. Now we use those same logs to build a log cabin. Now they become, again, they go back to becoming real property because they're an improvement now. They've been permanently attached to the earth again, and they are an improvement. And then we come with a bulldozer and we knock it all back down again. And now we knock it all back down again, it's personal property again. So real property and personal property can interchange their definitions. There's a weird exception to that. And the weird exception is factory-built mobile homes. So on top is a nice-looking factory-built mobile home, and on the bottom are crummy ones. You can see on the bottom, on the not nice mobile homes, here in the front, this is called the tongue. This is what you tow it with. And the FHA says that when you remove that tongue, that mobile home now becomes real property. It's personal property when it's being manufactured and towed to the site, but when you remove that tongue and permanently attach it, for instance, like building a deck on it, it becomes part of the real property. So this is a mobile home. It was probably bought in several sections, this top picture, and it was permanently attached with the foundation. So right now, it's behaving as if it's real property. But there is an exception to this, and the exception to this is, excuse me, even though it's considered real property, we cannot sell mobile homes on Sundays. Selling mobile homes on Sundays is against the blue laws because they're considered to be motor vehicles. And motor vehicles cannot be sold on Sundays. That's why you can't buy a car on Sundays, because there's a blue law in New Jersey that says no mobile homes on Sunday. In Bergen County, there's still some malls that don't allow clothing sales on Sundays. When I was younger, the only thing you could buy on Sundays was food or medical supplies. Everything else was not allowed to be sold on Sundays. Okay, so a mobile home starts out its life as personal property. It gets permanently connected. It's real property, but it still has a vehicle ID number, and you still can't sell it on Sundays.
Bruce.
Yes, sir.
So does that make a difference in when you got to pay the tax when it become real property versus?
Yes, yes. And in New Jersey, we do not have personal property tax. And down south, they do have personal property tax. So again, usually when you have a mobile home like these ones on the bottom, usually you do not own the land underneath them. Usually you are leasing the land underneath them. So you're only going to pay as much property tax as your little piece of land underneath your trailer is needed. Okay. But in other states, these mobile homes are considered personal property for purposes of taxation, and you have to pay a personal property tax on it.
What about the one at the end that has a little deck in the back? Does that
usually they would be leasing? Usually they would be leasing that land. So
okay.
Mobile home parks around here. There's a mobile park in East Brunswick. There's a mobile home park in Edison. There's a mobile home park in North Brunswick. On all of the mobile home parks around here, you do not own the land. You are leasing the land, and your mobile home is counting as real property as long as that tongue has been removed, and they're sold through the MLS. But again, because they have a vehicle identification number, we can't do it on Sundays. Okay, good question. The next thing is crops, and corn is a crop. It has to be planted every year. On corn or other crops that have to be planted every year, they count as personal property. And they count as personal property because of the doctrine of Eminent Rights. And there's an old concept that goes back to Roman times called fructus industrius, and that means the crops belong to the person who planted them. because they are the fruit of his labor. So if you are leasing a farm and you plant all your crops and the landlord kicks you off, you still have the right to harvest your crops. But trees aren't crops. Trees are real property. Crops are personal property because of eminent rights and fructus industriis. So crops are personal property. Again, trees are real property. They're considered to be permanent. There is a tree in New York City that is 435 years old. I watched it on a show the other night. They were taking people on tours to see it. That's pretty old, 435 years. The oldest tree in the United States was in California, and it was called Methuselah, and it was actually damaged by environmentalists by mistake, and it died. He is the most hated person on the internet now in terms of environmental issues. The poor guy did it by accident. So anyway, trees are real property. Trees are real property. Now, we have things that we don't know if they fit into the definition of real property or they fit into the definition of personal property. So we have a test in how we determine whether something is real property or something is personal property. And the test is MARIA, M-A-R-I-A. M stands for method of attachment. A stands for adaptation of the article to the real property. R stands for relationship of the parties. I stands for intent of the parties. And A stands for agreement of the parties. Now, MARIA is the test of a fixture. But we have an exception to our test of the fixture, and that's a trade fixture. A trade fixture is something that's used in a business that's permanently attached, like these built-in hair dryers. They become the personal property of the tenant when they're used in a business. So that means if the person who is renting this hair salon decides they're going to end their lease and move out, they have the rights to unattach the hair dryers and bring them with them because they are trade fixtures. Okay, so trade fixtures are the personal property. Trade fixtures are the personal property of the person who owns the business. And that's where the R comes in, relationship of the party, because you have to be a landlord-tenant in terms of a business to have a trade fixture. You don't have a trade fixture in a regular house. So my son closed one of his restaurants last week because in Corona, he just can't keep it open. He has 2 other restaurants that he's keeping open, but he had to close one. And his pizza ovens, which are very expensive and they were new, are permanently attached to the building. And when he ended his lease, he had the right to unattach those pizza ovens and take them with him because they are trade fixtures. However, whatever damage was done by unconnecting them, you can't leave holes in the wall or you can't leave pipes open. Whatever damage was done by unconnecting them, he had to repair the damage. Okay? And you can only have trade fixtures in a business. Now we're going to talk about fixtures themselves. So if you go to Home Depot, all these parts in Home Depot that are on the shelf, those are personal property. But when you put them all together and you build yourself a nice light fixture, that light fixture becomes part of the real property. And it becomes part of the real property by the M, method of attachment, because it's now permanently attached. It's now permanently attached to the real property. So when we put that fixture together and we attach it to the ceiling, there is a magical moment. That magical moment is called actual annexation. And what it means is just like Israel is annexing Palestine and Russia annexed the Ukraine, it means that the real estate is now taking ownership of this fixture, and this now becomes part of the real property. It's annexing the fixture, making it part of the real property. And that magical moment is called actual annexation. So again, method of attachment, adaptation, relationship of the parties, intent of the parties, and agreement by the parties. So let's talk about adaptation. One of the more interesting things about adaptation is many times when you go to sell a house, there's a garage door opener. And that garage door opener, when you push the button, the garage door opens. So when a buyer buys the house, there is an implication that the garage door opener, even though it's not permanently attached to the house, is going to be part of the real property. And why? Because the garage door opener is specifically adapted to the real property. The door opens on the push of the button of the garage door opener. So that's adaptation. Your front door key, the front door key to your house, is certainly very easy to move around, but your front door key is real property because it's specifically adapted to your lock. We talked to relationship of the parties and trade fixtures, and now I want to talk about intent of the parties and agreement by the parties. Because I want to warn you, in the 30 years that I've been in real estate, I have bought a number of people washing machines and dryers. And the reason is, you're showing a house and there's a washer and dryer in the basement. You write up a contract for a buyer to buy that house, and you forget to include in it that the buyer wants the washer and dryer. And then at closing, when you do your walkthrough, there's no washer and dryer. And the buyer says, I want the washer and dryer or I'm not closing. And the seller says, I did not intend to give that to you, and I did not indicate it in the MLS listing as something that was included, and therefore we didn't agree that I was going to leave it. Now I'm stuck because the buyer isn't going to close unless he gets a washer and dryer, and the seller's not going to give him one. So I have been forced to buy washers and dryers in the past in order to get the deal closed. Not by law and not by anybody forcing me. But if I wanted my check, I would have to make the buyer happy. And again, sometimes that meant buying a washer or a dryer or a refrigerator. So we express our intent in the listing, and then in the contract, we do agree to it. For instance, we might say it's our intent to include the refrigerator and the washer and dryer. Remember, the refrigerator, the washer and dryer are personal property because they're not permanently attached. And then if we put that in the listing, then the agents put it in the MLS contract, and then both parties agree, and now you have an agreement that the seller is going to leave the washer and dryer and refrigerator behind. And this comes up much more often than you would think. All right, again, we get the land that God gave us to the center of the earth below, to the heavens above, and all things attached by man or nature. This is our bundle of rights, very important. This is our bundle of rights. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't touch it, but it gives you all the rights that you have associated with your ownership of real property. Now, even though we have this bundle of rights and we can do all this stuff we want to do, unfortunately, the government can override our rights. And the governmental involuntary limitations on ownership of land is Pete. So the test of a fixture is Maria. The governmental or involuntary limitations on the ownership of land is Pete. Police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. So let's go to police powers first. Even though we have the right to occupy and use our property any way we want to occupy and use it, even though we have the right in our bundle of rights to occupy and build our property and the right to mine, drill, and farm our property, right? Unfortunately, the government can say, nope, you can't build that kind of house here because they can have zoning, planning, and building rules. So again, these are the limitations. These are the limitations on our absolute control of our real property. Police powers is like zoning, planning, and building. The next one is eminent domain. Eminent domain in Latin means for the good of the kingdom. So we have the right when we own real property to sell or not to sell or refuse to sell. Very important right, to sell or refuse to sell. However, if the government needs our property, in order to maybe widen Route 18, they can force us to sell. Even though we have the natural right to refuse to sell, the government can force us to sell through the right of eminent domain. And they do it through the right of eminent domain and the process of condemnation. The right of eminent domain and the process of condemnation. The next one is taxation. We have to pay taxes on our real property. If we don't pay taxes on our real property through the process of a tax lien certificate, then holding that certificate for 2 years, and then a foreclosure process, someone can foreclose on your house for the unpaid municipal taxes. And the last one is escheat. Escheat is if you die without a will and you have no heirs, your real property goes to the state of New Jersey. That's escheat. You die without a will and you have no heirs, your property goes to the state of New Jersey, and they don't pay anything for it because you don't have any heirs anyway. We also have contractual or voluntary limitations. Remember, Pete is involuntary. We also have contractual or voluntary limitations. Things like deed restrictions. I'm going to sell you this house, but I'm going to put a deed restriction on it that you have to keep the trees that are along my property line. An easement. I'm going to sell you this property, but I'm going to reserve the right for me to cross it forever. You can never stop me from crossing it. Or a lease. I'm going to lease you this property, and during my period of the lease, I no longer have the right to occupy it. You do. And a mortgage. A mortgage is a hypothecation of your property in terms of a security of a debt, and a mortgage allows a lender to take the property away from you in the event that you don't pay through foreclosure. Okay? So again, deed restrictions might be something as simple as no parking here. An easement is granted by a deed, and you can, if you want to check to see if there's an easement, you want to do a title search and look to see if the deed, somebody gave an easement or reserved an easement. Okay? Now we're going to switch, and we're just going to get some terms in place so that we can understand some future things. We're going to have present interest and future interest. Present interest means somebody has control now, and somebody very specific is going to have control later. We're going to divide the real property interest into present interest, who has the right to live in it and pay the taxes, and the future interest, who's going to get it later on. We also have corporal and incorporal. This word corp comes from the word corpse, which is like body. So some rights have body and you can touch them. Some rights are incorporeal and they're there, but you can't see them or touch them. So corporal or incorporeal. And then we have things that are herediments. Herediments are things that you can inherit. And we're going to see that there's a type of ownership that you cannot inherit. Therefore, it is not a hereditament. So again, present interest, future interest, corporal and incorporeal, and herediments. So a freehold estate is the highest level of ownership we can have in real property. A freehold estate and a fee simple is the definition of the highest right. It has an indefinite duration. It has an indefinite duration. That means it could last forever. An indefinite duration. And a completeness, all of the bundle of rights. That's a freehold estate. Completeness of the bundle of rights and an indefinite duration. We can also have a leasehold estate. In a leasehold estate, the only thing we're getting in a leasehold estate is the right to occupy and use. That's the only thing we're getting in a leasehold estate. And we're getting it for a definite period of time. That period of time is whatever the lease is. I have the right to occupy the property just for this period of time. That's all I have it for. So that's a lease. And a lease is a personal property right. A freehold estate is real property. A lease is personal property. What's better? It's better to have a freehold estate. It's an indefinite period of time, and it's a completeness of the bundle of rights. A leasehold estate is a definite period of time, the period of your lease, and all you're getting is the right to occupy. So when we look at the types of estates, we see freehold. These are all real property rights. So everything over here is real property rights. And then the other kind of estate is a leasehold estate. These are all personal property. When you have a lease, it's your personal property. And it goes away when your lease ends. Now you got to think about this for a minute. It's confusing because in these leasehold estates, they name it estate for years or periodic estate or estate at will. Well, that's confusing. You have to remember that those are leasehold estates, and the rights that are associated to you in an estate for years is personal property. But over here on this side, freehold is real property. Fee simple, real property. A life estate, real property. A fee simple absolute, real property. Fee simple defeasible, real property. And this we actually don't have in New Jersey, so we don't have to worry about this. Okay? So in a leasehold estate, when your lease is up, you got to move out. In your leasehold estate, when your lease is up, you have to move out. And your right of possession, the right that you have to be in the property, is only good during your period of your lease. When your lease is over, that right of possession goes back to the landlord. And this landlord is Mr. Roper from Three's Company. So he has what's called a reversionary interest, because while you have your lease, you have the right of possession, but when your lease is over, that right of possession goes back to the landlord. It reverts to the landlord, and therefore he has a reversionary interest. I think we have a question. Okay. Now, there's several different types of freehold estates. The highest level of freehold estate is a fee simple or fee simple absolute. This means everything. You have all the rights for an indefinite period of time. Fee simple or fee simple absolute. If you're buying a house, that's the one you want to have. Fee simple or fee simple absolute. These next two are freehold estates. So they're real property interests. They are freehold estates, but there's something special about them. A qualified fee estate can actually be several different versions of a qualified fee estate. It can be a defeasible fee, a qualified fee, a conditional fee, or a determinable fee. There's a really cool case of this in East Brunswick. So in East Brunswick, there was a piece of property that was on the corner of Hardenberg and Riva Avenue. Big piece of property. And here is Hardenberg, and here is Riva Avenue. And there was two old schoolhouses on here. 80 years ago, a very nice man in East Brunswick, in his will, left this big piece of land to East Brunswick with a defeasible fee. And what he said is, East Brunswick, I am leaving you this property in my will as long as you use it for public education. And so they built these two schools on it. But these two schools fell into disrepair, and they decided that what they wanted to do was East Brunswick wanted to make some money, and they wanted to sell all this stuff. They wanted to sell all this stuff to a developer. So East Brunswick said, I want to sell this to a developer, and they sold it all to a developer. Now, the problem with selling it to a developer is it violated the defeasible fee. So when you sold it to the developer, it was going to violate the defeasible fee. And if it violated the defeasible fee, let's get back to there. Sorry about it. If it violates the defeasible fee, you lose ownership. So East Brunswick, who had been left this property in their will, when they decided to no longer use it for the schools, instead they were going to let a guy build all condos on here, that violated the defeasible fee, and East Brunswick lost ownership. And the ownership went back to the dead guy's heirs. So he died 80 years ago. So East Brunswick had to track down who his heirs were, and they were going to be the rightful owners of the property. One of the reasons this became a big problem is when you do title search, you only go back 60 years. So the title insurance company missed the fact that it was a defeasible fee. And so when the builder paid East Brunswick for the property, and then the builder found out that the property was going to go back to the heirs of the guy who died, they needed to be compensated. And they got compensated by their title insurance company. Their title insurance company missed the defeasible fee, so the title insurance company had to make the builder whole again for the money he paid to East Brunswick, and everybody in that title insurance company got fired, okay, because they missed it. And the reason they missed it is in title insurance, they typically only go back 60 years, and this all happened 80 years ago. So that's a defeasible fee. In Ocean Grove, New Jersey, they have conditional fees. The conditional fee in Ocean Grove is you can own a house here, but you can't sell alcohol. So again, if you sell alcohol, you violate the fee and you could lose your ownership of the property. So these are all methods by which you are a freehold ownership of the property with a real property interest, but your property interest can be lost if you do something you weren't supposed to do, if you don't do something you were supposed to do, if you violate a condition, or you violate some determination that was earlier made that you'd agreed to. Those are all methods by which you could lose your ownership of the property. And when we were over here before, and I'm going to move us back a long way, when we were over here before and we talked about deed restrictions, a deed restriction is a contractual agreement to do or not do something with your property. So if you have a deed restriction that says no parking, let's say this said no parking, you wouldn't be able to park on the property. But if you did park there, if you violated the deed restriction would not allow the property to be taken away from you. It would just allow you to be fined or sued for violating the restriction. That's much different than a defeasible fee, because in a defeasible fee, in our defeasible fee over here, if you violate the defeasible fee, you lose the property. So that's a very, very big difference. A restriction, you can only be fined or you could be brought to court to force you to do the restriction. But on a defeasible fee, you could lose the ownership of the property like the builder did in East Brunswick. The next one is a life estate. And in a life estate, there is a movie about it called My Old Lady. Let's see. I have a question here. If you have an easement on your property, can others walk across it, or are they considered to be trespassing? No, they can walk across it. I'm asking because I have a Colonial Pipeline easement that runs through the back end of my property. I know Colonial Pipeline can go through, but not sure about others. That's an easy answer. That Colonial Pipeline easement, anybody remember what kind of an easement that is? Anybody remember what kind of an easement the Colonial Pipeline easement is?
Gross.
Good. Excellent. It's an easement in gross. Therefore, only Colonial Pipeline people have the rights to go on it, or people that Colonial Pipeline allows to go on it, not just anybody. Okay? And the other kind of easement is an easement appurtenant. That's when you have two adjacent properties. So Colonial Pipelines is a company, and Colonial Pipelines has the right to cross over that easement. Good question and good answer. You're learning your stuff there. All right, so a life estate is a special kind of a ownership of real property. And the purpose of a life estate is to allow you to have control of your real property one extra step after you die. So you have a house, and in your will, when you die, your house is going to go to your son. Okay, because a house is a hereditament. It's going to go to your son when you die. Your son now can do whatever the heck he wants with the house. He can keep it, he can sell it, he can, whatever he wants to do. So you only have control for that one step. But in a life estate, you have a house, and you're going to give your son the right to live in the house as long as your son is alive. He's going to have to pay the taxes. and he's going to have to do that thing we talk about, not to waste, which means make sure nobody with a claim of adverse possession shows up. And now he has what's called the present interest. Remember, we had divided the future interest from the present interest later, and somebody else is going to have the future interest. If that somebody else is a new third party, then they're called a remainder man. A remainder man. They have the future interest. And now your son has the right to live in the house as long as he's alive. So you've died and you've given your son the right to live in the house as long as he's alive. And when he dies, his present interests go to the remainder man. And now the present interest and the future interest recombine, and it goes back to fee simple again. So you were able to control it one more step because you let your son live in it as long as he was alive. He had to pay the taxes and not to waste. But you got one more step because now when your son dies, it goes to the remainder man. And that remainder man is the one who has the future interest. And let's see, there's a question here again. Okay, I guess that's the same one. I don't see a new question.
Hey, Bruce, I like when you give it to us the last time, you told us like the maid, the lady, the whole lady that was helping the father when the father.
Yeah, that's what the movie's about. I'll go through that.
House.
That's what the movie was about. In this movie,
Yes.
My Old Lady, Kevin Kline was one of the protagonists of the movie. He inherited a house from his father in Paris. So he goes to collect the house in Paris. And when he gets to the house in Paris, he finds that this old lady is living in the house. And she has been granted a life estate by Kevin Kline's father. So the old lady has the right to live in the house until she dies. She has the obligation to pay the taxes and not to waste. And Kevin Kline does not get the rights to the house until she dies. So he is the remainder man because that's an estate and a remainder. He is the remainder man. Okay, that's a life estate. Now, I'm going to get really complicated because there's other ways to do this. So we could have a house, and we could give the old lady the right to live in the house, this old lady the right to live in the house, as long as this guy is alive. When this guy dies, then she no longer has the rights to live in the house, and her present interests go to this guy. That's called an estate pure atra vie. An estate pure atra vie, because her ability to have occupancy and pay the taxes is only dependent on this guy's life. And that's what pure atra vie means. It means for another's life. Okay? So she would have a life estate pure atra vie. She would have the present interest. When he dies, her interests end. They recombine with him. He has the future interest. He goes back to fee simple. And
Bruce,
he has to move out. Yes.
you remember in Ozark there was a situation like that, that old man who used to live in the basement?
Yes. That's exactly right. In Ozarks, they were trying to buy a house and they couldn't afford anything nice. So they ended up buying a house where the old man in the basement reserved a life estate, which means he got to live in the house as long as he was alive. That's very good. That means you understand this stuff now.
I do.
Question is it safe for the remainder person, is it safe to say the remainder person is always much younger? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And is present interest the same as pure atra vie? Not necessarily. Present interest in pure atra vie, the present interests belong to the person who has the life tenancy. That person is living in their house. They have the present interest, but their interests only last in pure atra vie as long as this person is alive. When this person dies, their right to live in the house ends. That's called a pure atra vie estate. That's not how they're normally done, but it is a way of doing it. In My Old Lady, the old lady was granted a regular life estate. She was allowed to live in the house as long as she was alive, and when she passed away, her present interests would go to Kevin Kline. So we have her and we have Kevin Klein. Kevin Klein could sell his interest to me, but I wouldn't pay that much because who knows how long the old lady's going to live. And in France, there is actually a case of a woman who was given a life estate in a house after World War II, and she lived to be 120. So that means that whoever had the future interest had probably died already, and his future interests probably were in his will to his kids or his grandkids. So you wouldn't pay as much for a house where somebody had a life estate in it because they have the right to live in the house as long as they're alive. It devalues the estate. And that's what happened on Ozarks. They got the house for a bargain because they had to let the old man live in it until he died. Very good. Very good. I like that.
Bruce, I do have a question. Pure HOV, does that only refer to, I mean, depending on others' life, does that, or it can be depending on other things, not necessarily related to life, is that correct?
It wouldn't be a life estate then. If it was dependent on other things, like whether or not you built a racetrack on the property or whether or not you built a 5-story building to block my view of the ocean. It could depend on other things, but then it would be a defeasible fee. It would be one of these, a defeasible fee, a qualified fee, a conditional fee. Life estate implies that the present interests that you have are only as long as somebody's life, either the life tenant themselves, or if you have a pure HOV estate, the life of the third party.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. These things are much more common than you think because it gives people the right, you know, you want to give your house to your grandkids, but you don't want to have them be able to kick you out someday. So you give them the house, only the present interest. You reserve a life estate for yourself so that you can stay in the house as long as you're alive. They can never kick you out. Again, you know, it's much more common than you think. Now, here's the big question. How would you find out about one of these life estates? How would you know that there was one there? You would do it with a title search because life estates are done through a deed because any real property interest is done with a deed. So somebody would have had to either reserve a life estate when they transferred a property, like Kevin Klein's father did. He reserved a life estate in his will for the old lady. He reserved a life estate. So we would see that in his deed that transferred the property from himself to her as the life tenant and Kevin Klein is the one with the future interest. Okay? Or if you're an old lady and you want to stay in the house until you die, but you want to give the house to your granddaughter, you would, in the deed, when you gave it to your granddaughter, you would reserve a life estate. All right, so the grantor gives the present rights to the life tenant. If a third person is going to get it upon the life tenant's death, he's called a remainder man. If the grantor gives you a life estate and when you die it's going to come back to him, it's called an estate in remainder. I'm sorry, estate in reversion. It's called an estate in reversion. And then he is the reversionary interest, an estate in reversion. All right, so that's the end of chapter 4. And if you look at the end of chapter 4, there are a ton of, on page 191, of keywords. So all those keywords are going to be important. One or two of them I've seen here we didn't mention when we went through this chapter is chattel. Chattel is another word for personal property. And right under chattel is the word chattel mortgage. A chattel mortgage is like your lien on your car. When you buy a car, you give a mortgage to the finance company, but that mortgage is on your car. So it's a chattel mortgage. A mortgage on your house is called a real mortgage because it's on a part of real property. We also probably didn't mention the word devise, D-E-V-I-S-E. Devise means to pass your real property by will. In the olden days, a devise was to pass real estate, real property by will, and a bequest was to transfer personal property by will. Nowadays, we use devise to mean both. And a devisee is someone who is inheriting something. All right, see if there's any other things in here that we didn't touch on. Nope, everything else here we got. Okay, so now methods of ownership. When you have a fee simple estate, how may you own it? When you have a defeasible fee estate, how may you own it? When you have a life estate, how may you own it? All right, so the first types of ownership are ownerships that are by individuals, one way or the other, and they are severalty, tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenants by the entirety. And remember, we looked at that earlier slide I said it's confusing because in leasehold estates, we talk about estate for years and estate at will, but those are leasehold estates. You're seeing the word tenancy in ownership. And that's because the word tenancy means duration and extent of ownership. It doesn't mean that you're renting a property. We use the word tenancy wrong in our normal conversational English. Okay, so these are the forms of ownership. Wonderful multiple choice question, because all the multiple choice questions are 4 possibilities. Severalty, tenants in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entirety. Remember, we talked about that word sever in order to convert real property to personal property, because sever means to unattach. Well, this word severalty is the same root word, because what it means is you as a person cut yourself off from all others and own it all by yourself. So severalty is when you cut yourself off from all others and you own it by yourself. And when you own in severalty, you can pass your property by will when you die. We're going to find some properties that are not herediments. They are not herediments, and we can't pass them along by will when we die. But severalty we can. Now, the next 3 forms of ownership are all for more than one person. All for more than one person. The first one is tenants in common. And tenants in common can be more than one person, but it can also be more than one entity. Tenants in common means you have more than one owner. And one of the unique things about tenancy in common is tenancy in common has equal rights of possession. Everybody who owns in tenancy in common has equal rights of possession. That means they can go anywhere on the property. Equal rights of possession. And tenancy in common is a hereditament. So if 3 people down here bought a property together as tenants in common, and this one dies, this one can leave their property in their will to whoever they want. They can leave the property in their will to whoever they want, because tenancy in common is a hereditament. Okay? No matter how many owners you have, it's got to be at least 2. It could be 1,000, but it's got to be at least 2. All owners have equal rights of possession. And if you bring a contract to an attorney, and that contract has more than one name on it, the attorney will assume that you want to have tenants in common, because it's the least restrictive form of ownership of more than one person. So you bring a contract to an attorney that has 2 names on it, they're going to create the deed and the contract as tenants in common. The next kind of ownership is joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. Absolutely guaranteed at least once on the test, maybe twice, are these 4 requirements. In order to have joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, you have to have unities of time, title, possession, and interest. You all have to come into title at the same time. You all have to have the same degree of title, all fee simple, all defeasible fee, all life estate, all the same degree of title. You all have equal rights of possession, and you all have equal interest. Now, what does equal interest mean? Equal interest means that if 4 of us are going to buy a property together, all 4 of us will each own 25%. All 4 of us will each own 25% if 4 of us buy a property together. Now, the way joint tenancy with rights of survivorship works is that if one of us four dies, if one of us four dies, this guy dies, his share goes to the other survivors, other people who are the owners. And now, each of these guys will own 33%. And now this guy dies. His share automatically goes to these two. And now these two will each own 50%. And now she dies. Her 50% now goes to him. And he now owns 100%, but he owns now, because he's all by himself, he owns in fee simple, right? And that is a typical test question. They're going to walk you through a scenario where the other co-owners die. Now, there's other things that can happen here. It's just not about dying. Say that you have a joint tenancy, 4 people, each of you own 25% each, and this guy asks if you will let him sell his share to someone else. So he's going to sell his share to someone else. His share is 25%, so he's going to own 25%. These 3 that are left are each going to own 25%. You got 100% now. Now this guy dies. His 25% goes to these 2 guys. So now these 2 guys are each going to own 37.5%. These 2 guys are each going to own 37.5%. So these 2 guys are each going to own 37.5%, and that 37.5% then adds up to 75, and that 75% plus his 25% adds up to 100. So now let's assume we got this thing going on. He owns, this guy owns as tenants in common. This guy owns as tenants in common with this group. Inside the group, these guys own as joint tenancy. Inside the group, these guys own in joint tenancy. And their joint tenancy group owns as tenants in common with him. He owns 25%. They each own 37.5%. Inside this joint tenancy group, if she now dies, he is now going to own 75%. He is now going to own 75%. We get to that point. So he will own, sorry about that again. He will own 75%. He will own 75%. And this guy that originally bought the share from him will own 25%. And in this case, there's only 2 of them. So now they own as tenants in common. Okay? So what's the purpose of going through all this stuff? What's the purpose of having these rights of survivorship? Is that it avoids probate. If this guy, we have tenants in joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, time, title, possession, and interest. Each of them owns 25%. Now this guy finds out he's going to die next year. And he doesn't want his share to go to his co-owners. He wants his share to go in his will to his daughter. Well, he can't do that. He can't do that because he's locked into joint tenancy. What's the reason he might do that? What's the reason he might do that? Is if he owes a lot of money to someone else and he dies, keep killing this poor guy off. Now each of these own 33%. None of his debts can attach to the property because joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, the dead person's debts do not attach to the property. Joint tenancy avoids probate. So again, if he were to die and he owes a hospital $1 million, the hospital can't come after the property. And let's go through another scenario here. Same thing, all 4 of them own 25% each. And again, we're going to kill off this poor guy eventually. He finds out he's going to die, but he wants his share to go to his kids. He can ask them if they'll release him. If they say no, he can go to the court and he can sue for partition. He can file a suit for partition, and the judge would listen to his claims and the judge would listen to why they did this in the beginning, and the judge will decide, listen, you knew what you were doing. I'm not going to release this from you. You're going to stay with joint tenancy. If you die, your share is going to go to them. All right? I've seen this happen before, so this is not as rare as you might think. Why would somebody buy as joint tenants with rights of survivorship? Because if they did, and one of them died, and it was two butchers in Brooklyn that owned a butcher shop with apartments above it, they bought the property as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, each owned 50%. And the reason they did it was so that if one of them died, the other one could keep the business running because he wouldn't have to pay off anybody. He wouldn't have to buy anybody out. And again, when his daughter, who was in our class, found out that it was joint tenants with rights of survivorship, she realized she was not going to get half of the ownership of that building, which was worth a couple $1 million. And the next step was she went to the other butcher, the other surviving owner, and she asked if he would let her have some money. He said no, and he has every right to say no. So again, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship is not a hereditament. You can't pass it in your will. If we started out with 4 guys, 25% each, and one died, we'd have 3 owners at 33%. Another one died, we'd have 2 owners at 50%. And then finally, one of those 2 owners died. The last guy left would own in severalty. And this is also not as rare as you might think. Okay, how do we do this? We do it in a deed. How would an attorney know to draw up the deed this way? If you put 4 names on a contract, the attorney is going to draw up the deed as tenants in common because that's the presumptive form of ownership. If you put 4 names on a contract, you would need to instruct the attorney that Mo, Larry, Joe, and Curly are going to own the property as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Again, it is not the presumptive form. You would have to specifically request it. The next form of ownership between more than one person. Again, we can end a joint tenancy or a tenants in common. We could force a dissolvement of it with a suit for partition. The next form of ownership is tenants by the entirety. Tenants by the entirety is between a husband and wife. They have to be married. Recently in New Jersey, they allow same-sex marriage, so it can be between couples that are same-sex as long as they have a civil union status, which means they were married. And what this tenants by the entirety does, it gives an automatic life estate to the surviving spouse. So the surviving spouse has the right to live in the property for their life and has a ownership in it. After 1978, this tenants by the entirety was switched to New Jersey, switched to community property. And then we have a community property law. So we were changed in 1978 to community property. There's a question, so bear with me a second. No, no, I wish I could be that thin one day. So we are in community property state now, which means the spouse has an automatic half interest. Our date's important to remember the test, not the 1978 date. But what is important to remember is that because they changed this in 1978 and they did not get the law fully into effect for community property into 1980, we have an elective share in augmented estate. So we have an elective share in augmented estate in the event somebody was married prior to 1978 and then somebody died after 1980. How would we know whether to apply the old tenants by the entirety or community property? Well, they actually get to choose which way they want to be treated by the elective share in augmented estate. The next thing is a trust. In a trust, it's really a contractual obligation between a seller and a buyer, where the seller doesn't actually trust the buyer enough, and so the seller prepares a deed, and the seller, the grantor, gives the deed to a trustee. The trustee holds the deed, and if there's a mortgage, when all the mortgage payments are paid off, then the trustee gives the deed to the beneficiary or the buyer. And in the event that the buyer doesn't make all the payments that he's supposed to make, the trustee can return the deed to the trustor. Now, we have a lien theory state. We talked about that last night. If you have a deed of trust state, it makes foreclosing much more simple and much less time consuming. But that's not the way normally we do it in New Jersey. But we do have some property that's owned by trust. For instance, you might want to create a trust in order to protect your assets from a suit sometime later in your life. Typically, you cannot put a house into a trust unless it's paid off and free and clear. Because by putting it into a trust, it would be an alienation, and your mortgage has an alienation clause that doesn't allow you to transfer ownership. All right, so that was ownership by individuals. I just want to go back to one thing, that we have these different forms of ownership: severalty, tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entirety. And corporations can own in severalty. A corporation can own a property in severalty. A corporation can own a property in tenancy in common. A corporation cannot own in tenants by the entirety, and a corporation cannot own in joint tenancy. The reason a corporation can't own in tenants by the entirety is because a corporation can't be married. The reason a corporation can't own in joint tenancy is because a corporation has the potential of perpetual existence. A corporation might live forever. Therefore, joint tenancy would not be effective because nobody's dying. Okay? Now, here's the problem with owning in severalty, or owning in tenants in common, or owning in joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, or owning in tenants by the entirety, is you have unlimited liability. Somebody falls down and dies, and I had a dentist friend of mine who owned a property in Perth Amboy. He had $1 million worth of liability insurance, and somebody got drunk and fell down the stairs and died, and they sued the dentist because they figured he had a lot of money, and they sued him for more than $1 million. So his homeowners insurance only covered $1 million. Anything above that, he had to pay out of his own pocket. So you don't necessarily want that to be able to happen. So one of the ways to avoid that is to not own in sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorship gives you the potential of unlimited liability. How do you overcome that? You overcome that by owning in a corporate form or by owning in a partnership. You can have a general partnership or a limited partnership. A general partnership does give you some risk because you can lose more than you put in. In a general partnership, you can lose more money than you put in. If you have a limited partnership, your losses are limited to the amount of money you put in. That's why it's called a limited partnership. Now, I do want to let you know that we're just touching on the surface of the true legalities of all this stuff. This is just a skim of it. You know, we're not lawyers, and we're not really going deeply into it. Does somebody have a question here?
I did, Bruce. When you were talking about tenancy in common, you meant as far as a corporation as being LLC, correct?
So a corporation doesn't necessarily have to be an LLC. It can still own in tenancy in common. A corporation, could be a partnership, or it could be, a C chapter corporation or an S chapter corporation. Okay, or an entity, some other entity that is not set up as a corporation. And we're going to get to that in a second, because one of the things you can do to avoid unlimited liabilities, that's why you form a corporation. You form a corporation to avoid unlimited liability, because corporations shield you from the liability up to the extent, over the extent of the value of your corporation. So
right.
Some of the big Roundup company, who's the owner of the chemical Roundup, they're getting ready to they're getting ready to limit their liability in the cancer suits from Roundup. by corporate ownership. So
Mhm.
we have, and again, I apologize. I'm just touching the basics on this and the basics in terms of you passing the test. So the benefits of a corporate liability, of a corporate ownership, is it shields you from personal liability. One type of corporate ownership entity is a C chapter corporation. That gives you fantastic shielding, but you have the aspect of double taxation. A C chapter spins off dividends. You got to pay taxes on the dividends, and then what's left at the end of the year after you paid off the dividends and your income versus your expenses is taxable income. So you have double taxation. An S chapter corporation or an LLC, they're called pass-through corporations because you take your income, you subtract all your expenses, and your profit passes through all that, and you just pay the tax on your profit. But they still give you shielding from personal liability. So I own my real estate company as an LLC. So if you were to sue me, all you could get from me is whatever my LLC is worth. You can't come after my personal house. I'm trying to shield personal liability. That's why you're forming a corporation. Go ahead.
We have a 2-family house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we LLC'd it. So my question is, let's say the tenant decides to sue. What is the LLC protecting me from?
So let's say you have homeowners insurance of $1 million, and the tenant is suing you for $2 million. If you have an LLC, the most they can do is take the LLC away. But if you just own it by yourself, or you own it
With someone else.
They can sue you for besides the value of the house, they could sue you for your personal assets and even sue you for future income. So the way you keep that from happening is you own something in an LLC or a S chapter or a C chapter, then the only thing they can sue you for is the assets of the LLC.
Of the house.
Yeah, of course you're going to have homeowners insurance. So, you hope they don't sue you. My sister had a house in Cortland, New York, and one of the really bad winters, the Federal Express delivery man fell on her front porch, and she only had $250,000 worth of liability in her homeowner's insurance. He sued her for $400,000. So because the house was owned in her name, she had to risk having to pay the extra money, the difference in the money. But let's talk about the disadvantages of corporate ownership. And many times in real estate, the disadvantages are sometimes something to consider. For instance, if you own your home in a corporate entity, everybody who does work in your home has to have a professional license. If you own real estate in a corporate identity, you cannot represent yourself pro se in landlord-tenant. You have to hire an attorney. If you own your home in a corporate entity, you cannot appeal your taxes yourself pro se. You'd have to hire an attorney to appeal your taxes. So there are some disadvantages to owning in an LLC or an S chapter or a C chapter. Also, most of the loans that we get, whether it's Fannie, Freddie, or Ginnie, an FHA loan, those are only for people. They are not for corporations. We see a lot of people in the real estate industry buy a house under their name, get an FHA loan, and then try to use a quitclaim deed to transfer ownership to an LLC. That actually ends up being not a good transfer of ownership or a way to shift liability. That's something you'd always want to talk to your attorney about, because again, that doesn't necessarily mean you could do that. If you have a mortgage on your house that's an FHA mortgage and you shift the ownership to an LLC, the FHA could actually accelerate your mortgage and say you owe me all the money now, because those loans are designed for people, not for corporations. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I just got a little confused. So if you own a company that's an LLC and you get sued, they can come after your own house?
No, they can't if you own it as an LLC.
Okay, that's where I missed. I didn't think so.
Here's where it may have confused you. You buy a house and you pay cash for it. And instead of putting the house into your name, you put it into 123 Main Street LLC. Now, if somebody falls and gets injured, the most they can sue you for is the assets of that corporation, just what the house is worth. If you did not put it in an LLC, if you bought a property and you bought it and you paid cash for it and you put it in your own name and you only had $500,000 worth of homeowners insurance and somebody sued you for $1 million, well, not only could they get the house, but they could also come after anything else you owned for the other $500,000. So again, you know, it's always important when you're going to own homes or own real estate. It's always important to have a sufficient level of insurance. A couple of things, and this is not on the test, but a couple of things people do is as you become a serial buyer, you know, every time you're going to get a homeowner's insurance policy on each of these houses, you also go to your insurance agent and you buy an umbrella policy. The umbrella policy picks up anything that's over the amount that's in those particular homeowners insurance policy. So let's say you've got a $500K homeowners insurance policy and somebody's going to sue you for $1 million. Your homeowner's policy would pick up the first $500K and your umbrella policy would pick up the second $500K. And those umbrella policies are relatively inexpensive. So again, if you're going to be a serial owner and own a bunch of properties, look into an umbrella policy.
Okay.
Okay. Other forms of ownerships are syndicates. Syndicates is just a loose joining together, or a joint venture. A joint venture is when each of you takes over a specific responsibility for a short period of time. Like I'm going to come in and I'm going to do all the roads and then I'm out. You're going to come in and build all the houses and then he's out. And you're just going to make your profit and your money based on what your participation was at that time. The one we skipped over here is a REIT. A REIT is a real estate investment trust, and it's like a mutual fund for real estate. It's a special, very, very unique device for investing in real estate. You're buying shares, and a REIT has disadvantages. First of all, 75% of all the income has to come from passive sources. And passive sources are like holding mortgages or renting. Another disadvantage is 90% of the profits have to be distributed every year. That means you don't get the magic of compounding because every year you've got to distribute the profits and pay taxes on them. The other thing is that a REIT has to have at least 100 members. So if you wanted to form a REIT, you'd have to have 99 other people to join with you. And you can't have 5 members out of that 100 own more than 50%. So you've got, because that would be giving too much control to those 5 people. So you can't have just 5 people owning 50%. Most major shopping centers are owned by REITs. And you can look at all the REITs in the Wall Street Journal every day. There's a couple of gigantic ones. They've been consolidating over the recent years. Low interest rates have really been helping them acquire properties. And you can just buy shares of a REIT and follow the share values from day to day in the Wall Street Journal. So that's a REIT. Now we're going to go to more familiar things that you've heard of. And the first is a condominium. And I want to stress here that a condominium does not refer to the way a property looks. A condominium refers to a type of ownership. So the big building you see here is a condominium. And that means it has, everybody owns their own unit. Everybody owns their own unit. And down here in the common areas, the walkways, everybody owns as tenants in common. Why tenants in common? Because you have equal rights of possession. So you own your unit in fee simple, you own your unit from the walls in, and you own the common areas as tenants in common. So everybody has equal rights of possession. They were building some condominiums in New York City over the last couple of years where another case went to the Supreme Court because some of the new rules say you have to build a couple of affordable housing units every time you build something. And the rich people who were buying the units in here didn't want to even see poor people. So what they did was they made a special entrance just for the poor people, and the poor people could not use the rich people's entrance. And so again, that was found to be unconstitutional, so that's been changed. But a condominium, the people who own each unit own from the walls in, and they own the common areas as tenants in common. Now, a couple years ago, I went to look for a boat slip, and the boat slip was a condominium, which means I would have fee simple ownership to my slip here, but these walkways would be tenants in common. And everybody who was a co-owner would have the right to be on those walkways. You can have a garage. On Route 33, there's garages that are condominiums. You own your garage as fee simple, which means you own from the walls in, but the common areas that you all walk on and park on are all owned as tenants in common. And you can have a townhouse style of a condominium, which means everybody would own their unit from the walls in, fee simple, and they would own the common areas like the sidewalk and the street in front as tenants in common. Now, the way a condominium works is, let's pretend we're talking about this guy. He's going to buy a piece of land, and he's going to get a meets and bounds description of his land on his deed. Remember, a deed gets a meets and bounds description in most cases, and his deed is going to be called the master deed. His deed is going to be called the master deed. And now he's going to build all his condos on here. Each of these condos is going to have a unit deed. Each of these condos is going to have a unit deed with reference to the master deed. So when you look at the deed for one of these condos, the deed is going to read unit deed. That's how you know it's a condo, because it's a unit deed with reference to a master deed. And you're going to have a condo association. You're going to have a condo board usually. You're going to have a list of C, and Rs. That's conditions, covenants, and restrictions that govern what you can do. Like perhaps you may not be able to have a boat over 50 feet here, or perhaps you may not be able to park oversized vehicles here. You'll have a list of C, and Rs. Perhaps on these condos, you might not be able to put a for sale sign if it's for sale. Those are all things that might be in your C, and Rs. So again, in a condominium, you own from the walls in, you own your unit as fee simple, and you are a co-owner, tenants in common, of the common areas. And your tenants in common, because tenants in common means equal rights of possession. Okay, that's what a condominium is. It has nothing to do with what it looks like from the outside. Get a unit deed with reference to a master deed. You'll get a homeowners association with bylaws. You'll get a condominium map. These were created by the Horizontal Property Act and the Condominium Act of 1969. So condominiums have not been around for that long. They were invented in Brooklyn. Okay. The next thing is a co-op. I don't like co-ops, because what a co-op is ownership of shares of stock in a co-op corporation. A co-op is ownership of shares of stock in a co-op corporation. So you get shares of stock in a co-op, and you get a proprietary lease. Shares of stock, if there's 100 units in your unit and there's 100 shares of stock, you're going to get one share. Okay, your shares of stock are proportionate to the size of your unit. You're going to get a proprietary lease, because when you own a co-op, you're really not owning real estate. You're really owning shares of stock. And your proprietary lease gives you the right to live in your unit and keep everybody else out of your unit. And typically, when you sell a condominium, you're going to have to transfer these shares of stock from you to your buyer. And so typically, they're going to charge you a stock transfer fee. So if you're looking at a closing statement and you see a stock transfer fee, it means you bought a co-op. Now, in a co-op, you are not paying taxes to your municipality. In Edison, in River Ridge, there's condos and there's co-ops. A condo might have a monthly fee of $300 a month, but you're also going to have to pay the taxes of $600 a month. That's in a condo. In a co-op, you're going to have fees of $700 a month, and that goes straight just to the condo corporation. You don't pay your taxes directly. So those are the kind of differences. Another big difference in terms of co-ops is a co-op can have arbitrary and capricious rules for who can live in the co-op and who can buy. In River Ridge and Edison, one of the rules is anybody who lives there has to have income 3 times the maintenance fee. And we said the maintenance fee there was $700 a month. So even if you paid cash for your unit, you would have to prove that you had $2,100 a month in income. And you know, sometimes senior citizens, their Social Security is $1,500, and now with interest rates being so low, they may have a lot of money in the bank, but it's not earning them enough money to qualify for that $2,100 a month. So it's another reason that co-ops are not my favorite thing, because they can be capricious and arbitrary about who lives in them. Okay, and again, co-ops typically are much less expensive than condos. Co-ops are much less expensive than condos. The next thing we want to talk about is a timeshare. Timeshare, sometimes called vacation ownership, sometimes called interval ownership, and they can be deeded timeshares or leasehold timeshares. Imagine if you are stuck with a timeshare now down in Disney. You still have to pay the maintenance fee, but you can't let anybody stay in it. People can't go from New Jersey to Disney anymore. You know, we're restricting people to 14 days of quarantine for traveling between states. I don't like timeshares at all. Everybody I know who's had one, after they've used it 2 or 3 times, they've gone to Grand Bahamas 2 or 3 times, they don't want to go there every year. Timeshares are deeded or leasehold. If you have a deeded timeshare, if you own a deeded timeshare, every year on your week, you get the same unit. If you have a deeded timeshare, every year on your week, you get the same unit. If you have a leasehold timeshare, on your week, you're just going to get some unit in the complex. This year you might get this unit, this year you might get this unit. So you can have a deeded timeshare or a leasehold timeshare. Now, one of the strange things about timeshares is from chapter 3 last night, we learned that you can't get paid for doing a real estate related activity for another unless you have a real estate license. But the Timeshare Act in New Jersey allows a person without a license to be paid a referral. Excuse me. But they have to be paid in a non-monetary fashion. So if you're at a timeshare, you know, and you're going to go and you're going to look around the timeshare, they're going to give you free tickets to a show in Las Vegas. And if you refer your brother down there to buy a timeshare, you know, your brother is going to get, you know, try to buy a timeshare, get a timeshare. You'll get free tickets to a show in Las Vegas or a free week in a timeshare, but you can't get paid cash because your compensation has to be non-monetary if you're not licensed. So timeshares do allow a non-monetary compensation to an unlicensed person for a referral. And that's part of the Timeshare Act. Okay. Now, last night, I rushed you guys through the questions, and I don't like doing that. I just get too excited because I like teaching the class. So I'm going to ask you to spend about 10 minutes and come up with the answers for all of these. So about 10 minutes, even, you know, probably even less than that, and come up with the answers for all of these. All right. I get impatient. Sorry about that.
Yeah, very impatient. I only got to question number 3.
All right. A couple more minutes. I had a broker's class one time that had 4 girls in the class and 1 guy. The guy was Frank Pinto, who is he got his license and then he got his broker's license through us. And he opened his own office. He works he's a part owner in a RE/MAX office now. But in class, he would get all the questions done fast and yell out the answers. And the girls in class came to me and said, please tell Frank to relax. This isn't high school. He doesn't have to show us that he's smartest. So I had to tell Frank, please calm down. And he's a good guy, though. Frank's a good guy. These are very typical of the types of questions you're going to get on the test. So let's talk about the test for just a minute. 110 questions on the test. The biggest problem adults have, in my opinion, is that they have to concentrate for at least 2 hours. The test takes 4 hours. If you're iffy on the information, it'll take 3 hours to do it. If you know your stuff, it'll take 2 hours. But it's very difficult for adults to concentrate for 2 hours straight. They panic, your mind wanders. So you've got to learn some test-taking techniques for concentration. One of the ways is to practice taking tests. At the back of the book, there are some 110 question tests. Sit down with a timer, take the 110 question test, and go all the way through it. Don't quit halfway, and see how you do. I have in-class tests on the computer that I can set you up with a sample test that'll spit out a random sample test. And what I notice all the time is everybody does better on the first half of the test than the second half. And we're spitting out random questions. What that means is everybody concentrates real hard for the first half of the test and then gives up on the second half. Don't do that. A couple of ways to increase your concentration is to stand up and stretch. Everybody knows that. Another really unique way to increase your concentration is to raise your hand and ask for a piece of scrap paper if you can't bring paper in. And they'll bring you a scrap pencil if you can't bring a pen in. And you're going to write down some information from your question on the piece of scrap paper. But the trick is to write it with the hand you don't write with. If you're right-handed, write it with your left hand. You don't have to do this for long. You just have to write down a couple of things. What that does is it really fires synapses in your brain that weren't just fired because you're using a different section of your brain because of changing your hands. And it really does increase your focus and concentration. I tell men all the time, take your shoes off, because taking your shoes off increases your concentration. But women always wear loose-fitting shoes or sandals, so it doesn't work as well on women. All right, just techniques for taking tests. And take your time and read everything. So let's start with number 1. Which of the following statements is true? So these are just knowledge-based questions. Sometimes they seem like they're tricky, but they're not. They're just dealing in the nuances of every different aspect. So the A answer is, in a condominium, unit owners hold shares of stock. We know that's not true. You don't have shares of stock in a condominium. You have shares of stock in a co-op. Number B, in a cooperative, a master deed is recorded. No, we know that's not true. You don't get a deed in a co-op. In a condo, there is a master deed recorded. Your unit has a unit deed with reference to the master deed, so we know B is not correct. C, in a condominium conversion in New Jersey, tenants with disabilities and or 62 years of age are allowed to continue as tenants for 10 years. So let's pretend you don't know that. Let's pretend you don't know whether that's right or wrong. Let's look at D. The tenant owner in a cooperative does not have fee simple ownership. Well, we know that's the right answer because we know the tenant in a co-op has shares of stock. So we don't even have to consider this stupid C, which is not true anyway, but we don't have to even try to remember it if we allow disabilities or people 62 to continue as tenants for 10 years, because we know that D is true. Okay? Question number 2. So the answer to 1 is D, as in David. Question number 2. In New Jersey, condominiums are regulated by, and we said it was the Condominium Act and the Horizontal Property Act. So the answer to 2 is C. Condominiums aren't regulated by the Homeowners Association, although they might have rules and regulations. The Real Estate Commission has nothing to do with it. And the Securities and Exchange Commission has to do with financial
Right.
things.
I got that right.
Number 3, the occupancy rights of owners in a co-op building are based on, so if you own a co-op, what gives you the right to be in your unit? Not what's the ownership, but what's the right to be in your unit? It's your proprietary lease.
Oh, B.
That's the lease that gives you the right to be in your unit. Your shares of stock are your ownership. Okay, but the occupancy is based on your proprietary lease. Number 4, Alan, Joan, and Tony own 25, 35, and 40% of a piece of land. So how must they own it? Well, first of all, let's look at tenants in common. That's D. They own 25, 35, and 40. So they could be tenants in common. Now let's go to C. Could they be tenants by the entirety?
No.
The answer is no, unless you're in Utah where you can marry multiple people. But in New Jersey, we only allowed one spouse, so the answer can't be C. And it's not B in severalty because it's just not one owner. And it's not as joint tenants because they don't have equal shares, right? They all own different shares, so it has to be D. It has to be tenants in common. And based on owning as tenants in common, remember, they all have equal rights of possession. And that brings us to 5, which of the following is not one of the 4 unities of joint tenancy? And the 4 unities of joint tenancy are time, title, possession, and interest. So which one does not belong there? Equity. Equity. Okay. Very, very common questions on the state exam. All right, here's 3 more.
That's confusing. I'm stuck on number 6.
At number 7, test-taking techniques.
Yep.
When you hit
Move.
Move, that's right. And 4 hours is a long time, but you want to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed by a question.
Right, and then you go back if you have time.
Yep, you have time to go back, you can change answers. So we do not want to hurt ourselves. All right, let's go over these. These are also, unfortunately, very common questions on the test. So 3 people, X, Y, and Z, own property as joint tenants. That means that it is not a hereditament. That means that when one of them dies, his share goes to the other ones. So X, Y, and Z own it. X, Y, and Z own it. Okay. Z is going to die. And that means that now his share goes to, because it's joint tenants, his share goes to X and Y, and they each own 50%. And now Y is going to sell his 50% to W. Now he does have to get permission from X, but X said yes, and he's going to sell his 50% to W. And now the joint tenancy has been broken, so X and W now own as tenants in common. So C, X and W now own as tenants in common. Everybody get that?
Mhm.
Okay, let's go to number 7. And this is just like the butcher. And, you know, they make questions and you laugh at them. You should have seen that poor girl who realized she wasn't getting $1 million worth of inheritance. S&N bought a store building and took title as joint tenants. N died testing. That means he had a will. So S&N owned the store as joint tenants. N died. And his will said his property should go to his daughter. By the way, the butcher's will said his property should go to his daughter. But since they owned it as joint tenants, when N dies, his share goes to S. And so now S now owns the store in severalty, because joint tenancy with rights of survivorship is not a hereditament. It cannot be passed in a will. Okay, and just like the girl in class who now doesn't get anything, you know, when you create these kind of ownerships, you got to be prepared for the ramifications later on. And the benefit of taking this kind of ownership is that you avoid probate, that the dead person's debts don't attach to the property. You know, that could be a big deal. All right, number 8. K and U owned a combination apartment building, a small bar and grill. They shared profits. They didn't have an agreement. So we got K and U owning property. And one day U dies of a heart attack. So if after U dies, K still has the same share that he had before U died and no more, they must have been tenants in common. Because when U died, if his share went to someone else, K would still have the same share as they started with, so they would have to be tenants in common. If they were joint tenants, U's share would have went to K, and now K would own 100%. But in this case, it's telling you that they owned together, and since we now know they were joint tenants, they each own 50%, and when U dies, his 50% goes to someone else, so K still owns only 50%. So we know that the answer is A. They had to be joint tenants. Okay, now why do you have to know all this stuff? Because this stuff happens in real life all the time. This stuff happens all the time. Let's see the question. So the answer is, the question is, can you switch types of tenancy? And the answer is you can. But remember, the way you break, you can do it by agreement. If there's 3 of you that own as joint tenants with rights of survivorship and you all agree to break it up, you can do it. If one of you wants to break it up but the other 2 don't, then he can try a suit for partition, but he may not win because they may ask, well, this is the way you set it up in the first place, therefore that's the way you want it. But if everybody agrees, you could change the form of ownership to joint tenancy to tenants in common. Okay, we got another question.
No.
Okay, we're just asking for answers.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we did good tonight. We filled up the whole 2 hours. As soon as we get off here, I'm going to go ahead and try to record this again and get everything up there from last night and from tonight. If anybody has any other questions, I'm going to try to do an extra class tomorrow night. So watch for the invitation. It won't be a full 2-hour class, but you know, we're just trying to fill in some hours to get some of you guys finished or closer to being finished. I'll send you an invitation for tomorrow night. Muhammad is asking, what's the answer to number 8? And the answer to number 8 is they had to be joint tenants. It has to be both joint tenants. All right, that's it for tonight. Again, I'm going to put a small class up tomorrow night, a short class. Not required. Guys don't have to, you don't have to come. I just want to put some smaller segments together so they record easier to get on my YouTube channel. That's it for tonight. Everybody, good night.
Thank you so
Good
much. I
night.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Good night, Bruce.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.